What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and God, the ending of this is probably going to be one of the most important things that I think Marvel has been doing recently in Marvel Comics. So much so that, like, we literally just kind of have to cover this as a one-shot origin. So this takes place in Immortal X-Men, and it basically builds and expands on the origin of Mr. Sinister from Marvel Comics, going into the Sins of Sinister storyline, which will basically make the whole thing make more sense. So what this does here is this initially opens up with Mystique, basically making her way into a military base in New Mexico in 1943. Now, one of the things to understand here, and this is what's really cool, is that as she makes her way through, of course, using her powers and so on and so forth, subduing the different soldiers and so on, she ends up coming across Irene Adler. Now, one of the things to know is that Irene Adler, of course, the Mutant Destiny, she's a precog. For those of you guys who are not familiar with Irene Adler, if you know who she is, bear with me here for a second. Destiny is a precognitive where she can basically see the future. The further away she looks, or the further into the future she looks, the less certain things are. The closer she looks into the future, the more certain things are. But the thing that's going on here, and the reason why Irene Adler's even here in the first place and Mystique is meeting up with her, is because this is a laboratory, or basically a facility, where Mr. Sinister is working. Now, one of the things that I want to specify here is that Sinister is a character with an exceedingly long history in Marvel. And we'll talk about the existing origin for his character as we get further into this, specifically the story from 1996, The Adventures of Cyclops and Jean. But the reason why this matters in terms of it being in 1943 is because this is where Sinister was operating at the time. That one of the things that Sinister had done over the course of his existence is he had become obsessed with the idea that individuals were popping up around the world that had powers, right? Basically mutants. And so one of the things that he had done during World War II is he had experimented on people in German camps. The reason why that matters is because following the end of the war and the liberation of all those camps, a guy named Truett Hudson had discovered the journals of Sinister, and that's what led to Weapons Plus, right? That's what led to like Wolverine and Phantom X and the Stepford Cuckoos and all those guys, right? So a little cool bit of history there when it comes to how the Weapons Plus and Weapons 2 through 10 programs came into existence. Weapon 1 is Captain America. That actually was not based on the works of Sinister, at least not that I'm aware of, because I feel like the discovery of Truett Hudson happened after Captain America was frozen in ice. So I don't know, Marvel doesn't really reconcile that too well. But the thing that Irene Adler says, and while her and Mystique have a very lengthy history together, Irene Adler says she's here and she's quote-unquote assisting Sinister in experimenting on mutants because the end result, right, the ends justify the means. Like, yes, there's some pretty shady stuff going on here right now, but at the end of the day, what can be learned from this and the greater consequence of what Sinister is doing is more important than the lives of the people who are being sacrificed here at the moment. And that's one of those moral things that really plays into the nature of Destiny. Oftentimes, she'll let people be sacrificed in the moment if it goes towards something more important. Now, a person who can't see the future, of course, cannot necessarily see the bigger picture. And the average person operates in the here and now, not being able to see or even understand what role they play in the greater landscape. So to that person being experimented on, it's begging the question, why isn't anybody helping me? Whereas Destiny looks at that and says, because quite literally your life in the moment is basically meaningless. And your sacrifice here will go to a much bigger thing. But from here, there's really kind of a discussion between the two of them in terms of asking the question, how did Sinister survive his first death in the first place? And so what we do is we jump back to 1895 in London, England. And this is when we really start to get into the nature of Sinister's origin. That what we actually end up having here in a really, really cool moment is we pick up at 221 Baker Street or 221B Baker Street. Anybody who knows anything about that address knows that's the address of Sherlock Holmes. Now, one of the funny things about this, and I love that Marvel's doing this, Sherlock Holmes does exist in Marvel Comics. He was in the old Marvel Preview issue number 5 back in 1976. He was there for like one story. Nobody really cared. Ultimately, Marvel just kind of axed the existence of the character. I love that they're doing that by basically saying it was Mystique operating as basically Sherlock Holmes, pretending to be him. Whether or not it was like there is an actual Sherlock Holmes and Mystique was impersonating him, or Marvel simply just saying there never was a Sherlock Holmes and it's just an identity that Mystique is taking, is really just kind of, you know, up to interpretation, to be quite honest, because even now they don't necessarily clarify it too well. But what's cool is that the two of them basically end up meeting up in order to travel to Millbury House, which is where Sinister is operating out of at the moment. And in fact, when they get there, they don't really meet Sinister, they meet Nathaniel Essex. Now, here's the cool thing about this, and this is when we really start to get into this origin, because what ends up happening here is Mystique and Destiny have this conversation with Essex where he says, my work on the Essex factors would be much more advanced if I could be returned to the years I wasted on fripperies like love. Nathaniel Essex's wife died at some point, and so he really looks back on his life and says, instead of getting involved in things like love, I could have been working on my research, right? Like, love prevented me from becoming successful and focusing on more important things as far as he's concerned. Don't know I entirely agree, but nonetheless, right? What's really cool here is that Irene Adler chimes in and says, Lord Darwin, right? This is the time when Charles Darwin was still the top guy in the scientific community. She says that according to Darwin, the works of Sinister were basically a monstrous misunderstanding of Darwin's work himself. And she fears that basically she has to agree here. That she asks, have you ever read Nietzsche? Your talk of superior beings echoes him. His work also ended in madness. It is not too late to turn back. Now, here's the reason why this discussion matters here. And this is how we basically start to get into the origin of Sinister. In the early days of Nathaniel Essex, when he was in the scientific community and he was obsessed with the idea that basically mutants were popping up, what he's referring to as the Essex factor is the X gene inside of mutants that has not been activated yet, right? Remember, the X gene in mutants activates either through puberty or moments of high duress or something like that. But in having no real name called the X factor, he simply refers to it as the Essex factor. He names it after himself, is really all it is. But there came a point when he created this really kind of Frankensteinian depiction of what those individuals out there who are basically mutants and have powers would look like. He built his work on the work of Charles Darwin, and saying that Charles Darwin argues that evolution reigns supreme, that individual organisms, right, birds and bugs and animals and so on and so forth, that they all exist in these different environments and ecosystems. And over time, those environments and ecosystems will change, and that evolution will take hold of those animals and they will evolve to basically adapt in that environment. What got him cast out of the scientific community was his depiction of the Essex gene and his depiction of what a future mutant might look like, which was honestly very grotesque to the scientific community at the time. They considered him to be a madman, and they ultimately forced him out. And that's why he's here now, because he's kind of an outcast of the scientific community and is driven by this desire to prove that he was right. And so the cool thing about this is that them meeting with him really comes down to this discussion that he was attacked by somebody. He can't really provide any details about it. He didn't really see what happened. He just knows that he woke up and somehow he survived, and he believes that it was one of those mutants that exist out there. But following this leads to a kind of, a bit of detective work by Mystique, where she takes on the guise of an innocent young woman and starts making her way through the city of London when she hears somebody scream. And when she gets there, she finds Sinister killing a guy. And so that's when literally she fires a shot at him. He realizes she can shapeshift, so she basically, her existence verifies that he's right, that there are people out there with powers, right? Although it was already kind of verified up to this point. He ultimately takes to the rooftops and then runs back to his base of operations. When Irene Adler, or when Destiny and Mystique catch up to him, they find him transforming from Sinister back into Essex. And that's when he comes clean with the explanation. Now, one of the things to understand, this is where we kind of get really more broadly into this origin, or really the finer details of this origin. In Marvel Comics, Sinister, of course, Nathaniel Essex, his obsession with the mutant gene, the idea that there are beings out there who have incredible levels of power, that was eventually noticed by the villain Apocalypse, right, in Sabah Nur. That's who he's talking about when he refers to as the Egyptian who visited him and granted him powers. The idea of Sinister, or really Nathaniel Essex, meeting Apocalypse and explaining to Apocalypse his belief system that those individuals with powers are basically the next step in human evolution, that was something Apocalypse had never considered before. All Apocalypse knew was that he was just a being with incredible power and used that to effectively force societies against each other. He had followed the old social Darwinist philosophy that was instilled in him by Ball and the Sand Riders, which is only the strong deserve to survive. But when he met Sinister, and Sinister's argument was, there are people out there with incredible power, they can do incredible things, and they will lead the world into arguably a better future, maybe not necessarily better, but a different future, that Apocalypse kind of took that to heart and was like, so that's why I have the powers that I have. He almost saw it as a kind of like divine intervention, right? A divine purpose for himself. And this almost religious zealotry merged with his viewpoint of survival of the fittest. And that's how we ended up with the version of Apocalypse that we have today in Marvel Comics. But in order to ensure, because Nathaniel wanted to literally spend all of time being able to explore these genes and so on, that Apocalypse basically told Nathaniel Essex he would give him the means to do so. Now, the reality here is that when Apocalypse shows up to you and says, you know, I can give you a great gift, it's like being met by like Pinhead in the Hellraiser universe, right? Like the Cenobites. Like, I mean, sure, right? They have sights to show you, and they can take you to a new place of pleasure that you could never imagine, but it's a dark and twisted version, right? It's literally just pain and torment. And so because of that, it's one of those things where the gifts, quote unquote, of Apocalypse oftentimes prove to be more of a curse than anything else. And so what you're seeing here right now in terms of Nathaniel Essex having this almost kind of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde situation where the Mr. Sinister persona is like the evil one and Nathaniel Essex is the good one, it's basically the quote-unquote gift of Apocalypse, or him gaining these powers, really overriding him. But what he's readily admitting here is that the Sinister persona is taking hold. He's moving beyond his ability to control this version of himself. That a time's going to come when something's going to happen, and ultimately the Sinister persona is going to completely and totally take hold. More so than that, he literally argues that just by being a scientist and being able to just look to the future and see what direction things are going in, these individuals popping up, right, what he calls the Essex Men, or basically mutants, is really what that means, that where they're popping up, you know, kind of here and there, and it's a smattering of appearances, that by whatever manner and whatever means, the number of mutants in the world will increase. And what that's going to do is set humanity and the mutant population on a collision course. They're going to go to war with each other, if for no other reason than the fact that the rise in mutants will represent the elimination of humans. And so what he talks about is how he wants to survive and see all of that, but at the end of the day, it seems like it'll be impossible, that he's toying with the idea that he will inevitably die and perhaps even take his own life because of the fact that he doesn't want to become Sinister. And so what he says is he set in motion a way to guarantee his existence. But because of the level of insanity that he's putting out there, and because of the fact that according to Destiny, he represents a clear and present danger, that what ends up happening is he's literally locked in an insane asylum, but where he starts babbling on and he literally starts saying like red and black and just kind of talking to himself constantly, seeing a person that's not there, he refers to them as a ghost, and then he's ultimately destroyed. Like he literally dies in the middle of the night. And so where like where Mystique pretending to be Sherlock Holmes shows up here, bribes a guard, and then realizes the guard is corrupt, killing them, so that there's no witnesses to anything, and any story they can imagine can be concocted here. That what happens is Irene Adler goes back to Mulberry House and literally explores the residence of Nathaniel Essex. But she puts on what is basically a recording of Nathaniel where he talks about these different things. And so he says, Darwin said I was wrong, but I was never so proud as to say the same to him. His insight was profound. This is what my legacy will be. This is how I will be immortal, and to see how the world will play out. This is how we'll win the war against humanity when they try to destroy the mutant population. Charles Darwin was right. In the end, there is only one way to find a solution to my predicament: survival of the fittest. And so what we end up finding out here is that there are 4 canisters down in the basement of Sinister. And what he had done is he had cloned himself 4 times, that each one basically has a playing card on his head. This is why this is so important, because in Jerry Dugan's X-Men Volume 2, the Stasis storyline, we saw a version of Sinister that had a clover on his head. He didn't have a diamond. And so that version was literally like, I'm the only Sinister. I've always been Sinister. I don't know what other version of Sinister you're talking about. There's also one with a spade, there's one with a heart, and there's one with a diamond. And so what this means, and what Marvel's telling us, is every instance where we've seen Mr. Sinister in Marvel from this point in time in 1895 running all the way up until now, it's only been one of the 4 Sinisters. There have been 4 others out there. There are 3 others out there, and they've just been doing their thing. We've never seen them, or seemingly never seen them, and they don't know about each other. Or if they do, they're certainly not revealing it. But like, all of them believes they're the actual Sinister. So if they did happen to come across another, or if they became aware of another, they would consider it to be some inferior clone and would probably disregard it. They wouldn't really care about it at all. But basically, it's amazing because no version of Sinister that we've seen up to this point is the actual Nathaniel Essex. That guy's been dead for a couple hundred years. He's been gone for a long time, and all we've seen are clones running around. So let me know what you guys think about this new origin for his character. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.